The Pyrenees Mountains, November 1942. The treacherous border between Vichy France and neutral Spain. A woman was struggling through the waist-deep snow, her face a raw mask of agony and iron-willed determination. The temperature was well below freezing, and the brutal high-altitude wind, a merciless force at this elevation, cut through her worn clothes like a razor. She was alone. She was being hunted, and her left leg was killing her. But the source of her excruciating pain wasn't a wound from a bullet or shrapnel. It was the heavy, chafing, and unforgiving 7-pound prosthetic leg she wore strapped to her stump. A prosthetic she had grimly nicknamed Cuthbert. This was Virginia Hall, an American civilian, and at that moment she was the most wanted Allied spy in all of France. Her entire world had collapsed in the last 72 hours. Behind her, in the city of Lyon, the Gestapo, led by the infamous SS Obersturmführer Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, was closing its dragnet with savage efficiency. Her friends, her contacts, the brave men and women of her resistance network were being arrested, tortured in the cells of the notorious Hotel Terminus, and executed. Her face was on wanted posters. Her description was on the lips of every informer. Ahead of her lay the neutral sanctuary of Spain, a near impossible 50-mile journey on foot through some of the most treacherous terrain in Europe. Her guide, a local farmer, had taken one look at her leg and the blizzard conditions and had nearly abandoned her, declaring the trek would be suicide for a cripple. For a moment she paused, leaning against a frozen rock, the pain in her leg a blinding, white-hot fire. She knew her handlers in London would be frantic, desperate for any news. Pulling out her wireless radio, a piece of equipment so dangerous that its mere possession meant immediate execution, she began to transmit a final, coded message. It was a masterpiece of understatement, a message that would become legendary in the quiet, secret halls of the Special Operations Executive. It simply read, "Cuthbert is giving me trouble." This is the unbelievable story of the woman the Gestapo called the Limping Lady, an American amputee who was rejected by her own country's diplomatic corps, only to become one of the greatest spies of the Second World War. This is the story of how one woman, armed with a prosthetic leg and an unbreakable will, built spy networks from nothing, armed resistance fighters, outwitted the most infamous sadist in the Gestapo, and became a guerrilla commander who struck terror into the heart of the Wehrmacht. This is the story of the war's most unlikely and most dangerous secret agent. The journey of the woman who would freeze and bleed in the Pyrenees Mountains began not in the world of espionage, but in the privileged, comfortable society of Baltimore, Maryland. Virginia Hall was born into wealth in 1906, a tall, striking, and fiercely independent spirit from a young age. She was an accomplished student, a talented linguist, an avid equestrian, and a natural leader who chafed at the restrictive expectations placed on women of her era. While her peers were expected to marry well and manage households, Virginia dreamed of a world of diplomacy, adventure, and global consequence. Educated at the prestigious Radcliffe and Barnard colleges, and later pursuing graduate studies in France, Austria, and Germany, she was a true cosmopolitan. She moved through the capitals of a restless Europe with an easy confidence, mastering French, German, and Italian until she spoke them with near-native fluency. Her singular, burning ambition was to join the U.S. Foreign Service, to become a diplomat in an era when such roles were almost exclusively the domain of well-connected men from Ivy League schools. She was brilliant, she was driven, she was more qualified than many of the men who were accepted, and she was repeatedly passed over. Undeterred by the casual sexism of the era, she took a clerical job at the American Embassy in Warsaw, Poland in 1931. It was a calculated move, a way to get her foot in the door of the exclusive diplomatic club, hoping to work her way up from the inside through sheer talent and hard work. From the bustling, politically charged atmosphere of Warsaw, she moved to a post in Izmir, Turkey, a city of intrigue on the Aegean coast. She was living the life she had dreamed of, serving her country abroad, immersed in foreign cultures, her future seemingly bright. It was there, in the Turkish countryside in 1933, that a single devastating moment of misfortune shattered her life. During a hunting trip, while climbing over a wire fence, her shotgun slipped on the wet ground and discharged. The blast tore a catastrophic wound into her left foot. In a remote area with limited medical facilities, gangrene, the dreaded specter of infection in a pre-penicillin world, set in with terrifying speed. To save her life, doctors were forced to perform a crude amputation of her leg just below the knee. She was 27 years old. For most, this would have been the end of a dream, a tragedy that would define and limit the rest of their lives. For Virginia Hall, it was the beginning of a fight. For most, an accident of this severity would have been the end of a dream, a tragedy that would define and limit the rest of their lives. For Virginia Hall, it was the beginning of a fight. Fitted with a heavy, clumsy, and often painful wooden prosthetic, a device she would later grimly nicknamed Cuthbert, she refused to be defined by her injury. Cuthbert was not a part of her. It was a foreign object, a clumsy wooden anchor she had to master, dominate, and bend to her will. The process was an agonizing private war. She had to relearn the simple act of walking, battling the phantom pains, the chafing of the leather straps, and the sheer exhausting weight of the device. But with a core of steel that would later define her career in the shadows, she forced herself not just to walk, but to walk without a noticeable limp, a feat of incredible physical control and personal discipline. She had conquered Cuthbert. Her body was hers again. With her physical recovery complete, she set her sights back on her singular ambition. She reapplied to the U.S. Foreign Service, confident that her talent, her languages, and her sheer determination would now finally be recognized. The response was not a celebration of her resilience. It was a cold, soul-crushing bureaucratic finality. The State Department had a strict, unbending regulation, they informed her in a form letter, that barred anyone with a limb amputation from service. Her career as a diplomat was over before it began. It was a rejection based not on her talent, her intellect, or her character, but on a rigid, impersonal technicality. The very institution she so desperately wanted to serve had deemed her unfit, incomplete. It was a rejection that stung her for the rest of her life, fueling a quiet, burning resolve to prove them wrong. With her dream dead, a disillusioned Virginia Hall resigned from her clerical post and spent the next few years traveling Europe, watching as the continent slid inexorably towards war. She was in Paris in 1939 when the storm finally broke. Refusing to flee or sit on the sidelines, she found another way to serve. She volunteered for the ambulance corps in France. During the Phoney War, she ferried supplies and soldiers, but in May 1940, she was given a front-row seat to the chaos and horror of the Blitzkrieg. She witnessed the shocking total collapse of the French army, drove her ambulance through the flood of desperate refugees clogging the road south, and saw firsthand the arrival of the triumphant jackbooted Nazis in Paris. This experience, the sight of a great nation brought to its knees, ignited in her a cold, personal, and unwavering hatred for the Third Reich. With France defeated, she made her way to the coast and escaped across the Channel to London, arriving not as a victim, but as a seasoned eyewitness to the Nazi war machine, a woman now more determined than ever to find a way to fight back. She found herself in London during the Blitz, a city under siege, defiant and fighting for its life. It was here, amidst the rubble and the air raid sirens, that Virginia Hall's relentless search for a way to fight finally led her to the doorstep of a brand new, highly secret and highly controversial British organization, the Special Operations.
In Virginia Hall, they saw a perfect candidate. Where the American diplomats saw a liability, the SOE's unorthodox recruiters saw a unique and powerful set of qualifications. Her prosthetic leg was not a disqualification, it was a detail to be managed. What mattered was her iron will, her fluency in French, German, and Italian, and her first-hand, recent knowledge of conditions inside occupied France. She had a plausible, established reason for being in Europe, and a burning, personal motivation to fight the Nazis that could not be faked. They looked past her limp and saw the fire in her eyes. After a series of intense interviews and psychological evaluations, the decision was made. Virginia Hall was accepted into the SOE. She was put through their grueling training regimen at secret country estates across Britain. She learned tradecraft, how to detect a tail, how to use a dead drop, how to create and maintain a cover story. She learned to handle plastic explosives, to assemble detonators, to kill silently with her bare hands. She learned to operate a clandestine wireless radio, the single most dangerous piece of equipment an agent could carry. And finally, in August of 1941, she was deemed ready. Virginia Hall became one of the first female agents and the very first to be sent for a long-term assignment into occupied France. She arrived in the supposedly free Vichy zone, a territory ruled by a collaborationist French government, but crawling with German spies and sympathizers. She carried a new identity, Marie Monin, a determined, inquisitive reporter for the New York Post. Her cover would give her a reason to travel, to ask questions, and to meet people. But her real mission was to move to the city of Lyon, make contact with the fledgling French resistance, and build a functioning intelligence and sabotage network from scratch. She was stepping into the lion's den, a lone woman tasked with being the spark that would light a fire in the heart of Vichy France. Lyon in late 1941 was a city holding its breath. As the administrative center of the supposedly free Vichy zone, it was a dangerous and duplicitous world. A nest of collaborators, informers, Vichy's brutal secret police, the milice, and watchful German agents from the Abwehr and Gestapo. Into this city of shadows walked Virginia Hall, an American woman with a limp and a mission. With her cover as Marie Monin, a reporter for the New York Post, she had a plausible reason to travel, to ask questions, and to meet people. But every conversation was a risk. Every new acquaintance was a potential patriot or a potential betrayer. A single mistake, a single misread of a person's character would not just end her mission, it would end her life. In this perilous environment, her prosthetic leg, the very thing the American State Department saw as a disqualifying weakness, became her greatest asset, her perfect camouflage. She was the limping lady, an unassuming, almost pitiable figure.
The police who stopped her for identity checks would see her limp, their suspicion often melting into a flicker of sympathy. No one would suspect that this determined American woman, hobbled by her injury, was a master spy sent to set their country ablaze. She used this perception as a shield, moving through the city's clandestine world with a quiet, steely confidence. Her first task was to build a network from nothing. This was the painstaking, terrifying work of an agent in deep cover. It began with a single, vetted contact, a spark from which she had to build a fire. She started to recruit, relying on her sharp intuition and her ability to read people. The network she built, which London codenamed Heckler, became a diverse and brilliantly effective web of ordinary French citizens turned patriots. There was Dr. Jean Rousset, a respected physician whose clinic became a safe house and an underground hospital for wounded agents and downed Allied airmen. There was Germaine Guerin, the formidable owner of a prominent Lyon brothel. Guerin was one of Virginia's most valuable assets. Her establishments were frequented by German officers and Vichy officials, making them unparalleled listening posts for high-value intelligence. The brothels also served as perfect safe houses, places where strange men coming and going at all hours would attract no undue attention. She recruited railway workers who provided a constant stream of priceless intelligence on German troop trains and supply movements. She found housewives who could hide agents in their spare rooms, and priests who could use the sanctity of their churches to protect fugitives. Each recruit was a node in a growing network, a web of trust in a world of betrayal. With her network in place, Virginia became more than an intelligence gatherer. She became a logistics officer for a secret army. She was the central hub, the organizer who turned raw French courage into a tangible threat. The lifeblood of this effort came from the sky. She orchestrated a series of daring parachute drops in lonely fields and remote plateaus in the dead of night. The process was a nerve-shredding exercise in precision and trust. It would begin with a nonsensical, coded message broadcast over the BBC from London. Phrases like, "The giraffe has a sore throat," or "Napoleon's hat is in the ring," signals to her local team that a drop was scheduled for that night. Virginia and her contacts would then head to a prearranged location, waiting in the cold and darkness. They would use signal lamps to flash a specific letter in Morse code to the sky as the deep, telltale thrum of a British Halifax bomber's engines grew from a whisper to a roar. The bomber would fly in low and fast, dropping a series of precious canisters by parachute. Inside was the arsenal of the resistance. Compact Sten guns, powerful Bren-light machine guns, slabs of plastic explosive, time pencil detonators, radios, and just as importantly, money to fund the entire operation. Beyond arming the resistance, Virginia established one of the first and most successful escape lines out of France. The network, which she personally managed, was known as the Shepherdess. It was a secret railroad of safe houses, hidden routes, and trusted guides that stretched from the heart of France to the Spanish border. Through this network, she funneled dozens of downed Allied airmen and escaped prisoners of war to safety. She was their shepherdess, the unseen hand guiding them through a hostile land, arranging for forged documents, food, and shelter, moving them from one safe point to the next until they could be passed to guides who would take them on the final, perilous journey over the Pyrenees. Every airman she saved was not just a life returned, but a highly trained pilot or crewman who could return to the skies to fight again. Through it all, with the help of her dedicated wireless radio operator, she transmitted a constant stream of vital intelligence back to London, reports that shaped Allied strategy, and proved so valuable that her handlers in London came to regard her as their single most effective agent in France.
In the world of shadows where Virginia Hall operated, success was a double-edged sword. Every Allied airman she saved, every bridge her agents scouted for sabotage, every piece of vital intelligence she transmitted to London was a victory for the Allies. But it was also another pinprick, another irritation, another wound in the side of the German occupation. By the spring of 1942, those pinpricks had become a torrent. The intelligence flowing from the Heckler network was so significant, and the resistance in the Lyon area so unnervingly well organized, that it came to the personal attention of the new head of the Gestapo in the region, a man who would become one of the most infamous war criminals in history, SS Obersturmführer Klaus Barbie. Barbie was not a simple bureaucrat or a distant commander. He was a hands-on monster, a sadist who took a personal role in the brutal work of crushing the French resistance. His headquarters at the Hotel Terminus in Lyon became a notorious center of torture, a place of screams and despair from which few emerged alive. He was methodical, he was intelligent, and he was utterly ruthless. He began to systematically dismantle the resistance networks in his sector, using a terrifying combination of infiltration, electronic direction finding to locate clandestine radios, and the brutal interrogation of captured agents. As his men arrested and tortured their way up the chain of command, one name, one description kept emerging from the lips of broken men and women. A mysterious, highly effective agent, a central figure who seemed to be organizing everything. They didn't know her name, but they knew she was a woman. They knew she was American, and they knew she had a limp. Klaus Barbie became obsessed. To him, this agent was not just an enemy, she was an affront. The idea that a woman, an American woman, a disabled woman, was outwitting his entire security apparatus was a personal and professional humiliation. He dedicated immense resources to finding her. He put a massive price on her head. He plastered wanted posters across the region, desperately seeking any information on La Dame qui boite, the limping lady. German internal communications referred to her by the codename Artemis. In his mounting frustration, Barbie famously declared to his subordinates, "I would give anything to get my hands on that limping Canadian bitch." He didn't even know her nationality, but he knew she was his most dangerous and elusive enemy. The duel between the spy and the spy hunter had begun. For Virginia, Barbie's obsession turned her world into a closing trap. The risks she took became ever more extreme. She was forced to change her appearance constantly, dyeing her hair, altering her clothes, and perfecting a shuffling gait to disguise her specific telltale limp. She could never sleep in the same place for more than a few nights. Every knock on the door, every stranger's glance on the street could be the end. Then, in November 1942, the fragile illusion of Vichy France completely collapsed. In response to the Allied landings in North Africa, codenamed Operation Torch, Hitler ordered his forces to occupy the so-called Free Zone. German jackboats now marched openly on the streets of Lyon. The Gestapo's dragnet tightened with suffocating speed. Barbie's men were everywhere, their power now absolute. The arrests accelerated. Virginia's networks, once so effective, began to be compromised one by one. Her friends, the very people she had recruited and worked with, the brave French patriots who had trusted her, were disappearing into the cells of Montluc prison, Barbie's personal fortress of torture. Her own life was now in imminent daily danger. The circle was closing. She had to flee, or she would be next. With the Gestapo closing in, Virginia's escape from Lyon was a frantic, desperate affair. Betrayal was everywhere. Her main radio operator had been captured, and she knew it was only a matter of time before torture would reveal her own location and identity. There was only one way out, south, to the formidable wall of the Pyrenees mountains and the hope of sanctuary in neutral Spain. The journey by train and on foot to the border was a nerve-shredding ordeal, a gauntlet of German patrols and Vichy police checkpoints where a single slip, a single question about her accent or her forged papers would mean capture. She finally reached a small village at the foot of the mountains, where she met the guide who had been arranged to take her and a small group of other fugitives on the final, perilous leg of the journey. He was a local farmer, a man accustomed to the mountains, and he took one look at Virginia and her noticeable limp and refused to go. To take a cripple, as he called her, on a 50-mile trek through the snow-choked high-altitude passes in the dead of winter was not just a risk. In his eyes, it was a guaranteed death sentence for the entire group. Virginia, a woman who had faced down the Gestapo for over a year, was not about to be stopped by the prejudice of a mountain guide. She argued, she pleaded, she bribed, and she shamed him. Finally, grudgingly, he relented. The journey began. What followed was an almost superhuman feat of endurance, an ordeal that would have broken even seasoned mountaineers. The 50-mile journey was a vertical hell. They climbed for hours on end through waist-deep snow into the thinning, freezing air of the high passes. For Virginia, every step was a unique form of torture. Her prosthetic leg, Cuthbert, became her personal enemy. The 7-pound device, made of wood and aluminum, was not designed for this. It offered no purchase on the icy slopes. With each step, it sank deep into the snow, forcing her to expend enormous energy just to pull it free for the next agonizing step. Her stump began to bleed, the blood freezing in the sub-zero temperatures. The group traveled for 2 full days and nights with almost no rest. At one point, her guide, seeing her struggle, again suggested she turn back. Virginia's response was simple and absolute. She would rather shoot herself with her own pistol than be taken by the Germans. She would go on. It was during this brutal trek, pausing for a brief moment of rest against a frozen rock, that she sent her now legendary message to her handlers in London, a masterpiece of laconic stiff upper lip understatement that perfectly masked the agony she was enduring. Cuthbert is giving me trouble. Finally, after more than 50 hours of non-stop struggle, they stumbled across the border into Spain. She had made it. She had survived. But her ordeal wasn't over. Exhausted and suffering from severe frostbite, she was almost immediately arrested by Spanish border guards for crossing the border illegally. Thrown into a squalid Spanish prison, her situation was still perilous. It was only through the determined intervention of the American embassy in Madrid, who were alerted to her plight, that she was finally released after 6 long weeks. She had survived the Gestapo, she had survived the mountains, and she had survived a Spanish jail.
For any normal person, the story would have ended there. A close call, a miraculous escape, a well-deserved retirement from the shadow war. Virginia Hall had served for 15 months in the heart of enemy territory. She had built one of the most effective intelligence networks in France, saved dozens of Allied lives, and had escaped the clutches of the Gestapo's most notorious hunter. She had earned her rest. But Virginia Hall was not a normal person. She was not relieved. She was furious. She was furious that she had been forced to flee, furious that her carefully constructed heckler network had been shattered, and heartbroken that her friends, the brave French patriots she had recruited, were now either dead or suffering unspeakable horrors in Klaus Barbie's prisons. She did not see her escape as an ending. She saw it as an interruption. Upon her return to London, she immediately began agitating to be sent back into the fight.
She walked back into the headquarters of the Special Operations Executive and demanded a new mission, a new identity, a new chance to strike back at the regime she so despised. But the SOE, while celebrating her incredible survival, refused. From their perspective, her cover was permanently blown. Her description, and especially her distinctive limp, were now known to the Gestapo throughout France. To send her back, they argued, would be a suicide mission. She was, in the cold calculus of espionage, a compromised asset. This bureaucratic caution infuriated Virginia. She had not survived the Pyrenees to be put behind a desk. For months she argued, she pleaded, and she raged against the SOE's decision, but they would not budge. So just as she had done in 1941, when her own country had rejected her, she found another way. She turned to a new, upstart American intelligence organization, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency. The OSS was thrilled at the prospect of recruiting an agent with her experience and legendary reputation. She was exactly the kind of seasoned, field-tested operative their new organization desperately needed. They welcomed her with open arms, but they too had serious reservations about sending her back into the field. Her OSS file noted their concerns. They worried that her prosthetic leg, Cuthbert, made her too conspicuous, too much of a liability for a return mission into a France now completely and brutally controlled by the Gestapo. But this time, Virginia was not a hopeful applicant. She was a legendary field agent, and she would not take no for an answer. Her response to their concerns was blunt and utterly dismissive. She told her superiors that as long as she could get her work done, her leg was her own business and of no concern to them. Her sheer force of will, her cold, unshakable confidence in her own abilities was impossible to deny. The OSS relented. Virginia Hall would get her wish. She was going back to war. Virginia Hall was going back to war. But she could not return as the sophisticated American reporter Marie Monet. That identity was blown, her description known to every Gestapo outpost in France. She needed a new disguise, one so convincing it would render her invisible. With the help of the OSS's makeup and disguise artists, she underwent a complete transformation. Her reddish hair was dyed a mousy gray. Her fashionable clothes were replaced with the rough, worn-out garments of a French peasant. A dentist ground down her straight white American teeth to resemble the poor dental hygiene of a rural farm woman. Most importantly, she perfected a new way of walking, a slow, shuffling, stooped gait that was the natural walk of an elderly woman who had spent a lifetime working in the fields. It was a walk that completely disguised the specific, telltale limp of her prosthetic leg. She had become Marcelle Montagne, an old milkmaid. Her return to France in March 1944 was a clandestine operation of the highest risk. Parachuting in was out of the question. The impact of a landing could shatter her leg and her stump. Instead, she was taken by a Royal Navy motor torpedo boat under the cover of darkness across the English Channel. As the small, fast boat approached the coast of Brittany, a coastline still heavily patrolled by the German Kriegsmarine, she was transferred to a small dinghy and rowed ashore, landing on a cold, dark, and hostile beach. She was alone, armed with a new identity, a radio, and the same unbreakable will. Her new mission was even more dangerous and ambitious than the first. She was no longer just an organizer of spies in a semi-occupied zone. She was now an OSS agent in a France that was an armed camp, a nation crawling with German troops preparing for the imminent Allied invasion. This time, her role was not just to gather intelligence, it was to become a guerrilla commander. Moving inland from the coast, she made her way to the Haute-Loire region of central France, a rugged, mountainous area known for its independent and fiercely anti-German population. She was no longer the limping lady of Lyon. She had become the milkmaid of the Maquis.
In the rugged hills of the Haute-Loire, Virginia Hall found her army. The Maquis were a motley collection of patriots, escaped prisoners, and young men fleeing forced labor in Germany. They were brave and they were numerous, but they were poorly armed and lacked central leadership. Virginia became that leadership. She linked up with the newly arrived Jedburgh teams, elite three-man special forces units from the US, UK, and France, who were dropped in to arm and lead the resistance, and she became their operational heart. While the Jedburghs provided the tactical military expertise, Virginia provided the irreplaceable local knowledge, the logistical genius, and the sheer unyielding drive. She was the one who knew which farmers could be trusted, which roads were unguarded, and where to find the safest locations for a parachute drop. She began to organize airdrops on a massive scale, transforming her sector into one of the best-supplied resistance zones in all of France. Night after night, she would coordinate with London, and the skies over central France would drone with the sound of Allied bombers, not dropping bombs, but hundreds of canisters filled with the tools of rebellion. Sten guns, Bren guns, powerful bazookas, Mills bombs, and tons of plastic explosive. She armed and trained 3 entire battalions of French freedom fighters, molding them from a disorganized rabble into a disciplined and brutally effective guerrilla army. She taught them the ungentlemanly arts of war she had learned from the SOE. How to use plastic explosives to sever railway lines with a clean, untraceable cut. How to use time pencil detonators to strike a train when it was in a tunnel or on a bridge for maximum effect. How to set the perfect ambush. Her symphony of sabotage began in earnest in the weeks following the D-Day landings. As the Allied armies fought desperately to break out of the Normandy beachhead, Virginia's mission was clear and critical: wage a total guerrilla war behind the lines to prevent German reinforcements from ever reaching the front. Her operations were a masterpiece of coordinated chaos. Her teams blew up 4 critical bridges over the Loire River, vital arteries for German armor and infantry moving north. They derailed numerous freight trains, creating logistical nightmares and depriving the Wehrmacht of precious fuel, ammunition, and supplies. They severed key railway lines and underground communication cables, plunging German command posts into silence and confusion, forcing them to rely on radio transmissions that could be intercepted by Bletchley Park. But this was no longer just a war of sabotage. Under Virginia's direction, her Maquis units engaged in direct, bloody combat. In pitched battles and lightning-fast ambushes, her forces killed over 150 German soldiers and captured more than 500. Her operations created an atmosphere of constant chaos and paranoia deep behind the German lines, severely disrupting the Wehrmacht's ability to respond to the Allied breakout under General Patton. She personally scouted the targets, coordinated the attacks via her radio operator, and, despite the immense personal risk, often oversaw the missions from the front. This was a one-legged American woman disguised as an old peasant directing French farmers and factory workers in a successful secret war against the German army. Her forces became so effective that they tied down thousands of German troops, including elements of the elite 11th Panzer Division that were desperately needed to fight the main Allied armies.
She was, in effect, running her own private war in the heart of France. As Allied armies swept across France in the late summer of 1944, the secret war that Virginia Hall had waged so brilliantly in the shadows finally came into the light. With her sector liberated, she emerged from her cover, no longer an old milkmaid, but a legendary American agent, celebrated as a hero by the French resistance fighters she had led. Her incredible service was officially recognized by the grateful nations she had fought for. The French awarded her the prestigious Croix de Guerre with palm. The British, who had first given her the chance to fight, made her an honorary member of the Order of the British Empire. And from her own nation, the United States, the nation whose State Department had once deemed her unfit for service, came the highest honor. President Harry T. Truman himself wanted to award her the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest award for valor, second only to the Medal of Honor. He wanted to bestow it upon her in a public ceremony at the White House to celebrate her as a national hero. But Virginia, ever the spy, refused. She had lived her life in the shadows and had no desire for public acclaim. She insisted on a private, unpublicized ceremony. In the office of OSS Chief General William Wild Bill Donovan, in a small gathering with her mother present, Virginia Hall was presented with the medal. She became the only civilian woman to be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross in the Second World War. The citation praised her for establishing and maintaining a secret intelligence network of the first importance, and for her later role in organizing, training, and supplying resistance groups, citing her extraordinary heroism and outstanding courage. The quiet, private ceremony was a perfect reflection of the woman herself, a quiet professional who saw her duty not as a path to glory, but as a job that needed to be done. After the war, when the OSS was disbanded and reformed into the CIA, Virginia Hall became one of its first female officers. She continued her life of quiet, anonymous service, working as an intelligence analyst, her expertise on French resistance networks and tradecraft highly valued within the agency. She met and married a fellow OSS agent, Paul Guyot, and they worked together at the CIA for years. She retired in 1966 at the mandatory age of 60, fading into a quiet life on a farm in Maryland. For decades, her full story remained a closely guarded secret, locked away in declassified files, her name known only to a handful of intelligence professionals. Virginia Hall's story is one of the most incredible tales of the entire war. She was a woman who refused to be defined by her limitations, who turned a perceived weakness into her greatest strength. She faced down the prejudice of her own government and the calculated brutality of the Gestapo with equal, unyielding courage. In a world of shadows, she was a beacon of resistance, a master of the ungentlemanly warfare that was so crucial to the Allied victory. She was the unlikely spy, the brilliant organizer, the guerrilla commander, the one-legged woman who outsmarted and outfought the Nazi regime. She was, in the words of the enemy who hunted her and whose empire she helped to destroy, the most dangerous of them all.